Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, January 10, 2025. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. In our first interview of 2025, journalist and filmmaker Nelofer Pazira-Fisk sits down with Libby Davies to discuss her experience completing her late husband's book on Middle Eastern politics, and shares her reflections on how Western mainstream media could be doing a better job reporting on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Here is that conversation. Take a listen.
Thank you so much, Nelofer, for speaking with me today. It must be 20 years ago that we last met in Ottawa, and I'm so delighted to reconnect with you, particularly with the publication of this incredibly important book by Robert Fisk, Night of Power, The Betrayal of the Middle East, published in 2024 by HarperCollins. A weighty book of over 600 pages, it documents Robert's more than 4 decades of legendary journalism experience and history in the Middle East. I recall hearing Robert in Ottawa in the mid-1990s on Parliament Hill. He told us, "I've been criticized by dictators and so-called democracies, Western leaders, and those on all sides." What stayed with me was that above and beyond those self-serving critiques, his legacy is historical truth and meticulous documentation that in the end cannot be ignored. Nelofer, congratulations on completing this tremendous accomplishment for Robert, and my deepest condolences on his death in 2020. Share with us the meaning of the title, The Night of Power, and what it meant to Robert as he wrote this book.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Libby. And you're right, Robert was not a darling of people of authority in all forms and colors. Night of Power, which is the title of the book, The Betrayal of the Middle East, the second title somehow explains the choice of the title for him. And he wrote the preface in 2014. In that preface, he outlined the reason for the choice because he, after living for nearly 5 decades in the Muslim Arab world, he felt that Night of Power, which obviously is, in Arabic, it means Laylatul Qadr, or the longest night. It's a night when Muslims believe that the Quran was revealed, which is the 27th night of the month of Ramadan, or the holy month of Ramadan, month of fasting. And for Robert, it signified this prolonged periods of nights and darkness that prevailed across the Middle East. And it continued, and it still continues. And he explained his reason that the question that Muslims and Arabs are asking themselves, and Robert put that forward in this preface, was that how come the Muslim Arab world is being dominated militarily, politically, culturally by the West and by the outside? And that signifies the decades of colonization. And when we look across the map, so since the Sykes-Picot, which Robert often referred to in the 1916, the secret French and English conversations, which eventually they ended up dividing the Middle East into what we call the modern states now. And then the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd of 1917, which followed, that created the State of Israel and gave the Palestinian lands to that. He always referred to those 2 dates as the time in history of the Muslim Arab world where the divisions have been sown so deeply and so badly. And when we are looking at this very moment of what is unfolding in the region, the Muslim Arab world has never been so battered and devastated and in such a state of tragedy, even greater than the 4 years ago when Robert was, finishing this book.
Hmm. Yes, well, I mean, the title is very powerful, and so the story behind that, I think, is very revealing for people. Thank you for that. Nella, for one of the most powerful elements in the book that draws the most ire or even jealousy, maybe, of Western journalists was Robert's ability to personally reach out to some of the most challenging actors in the Middle East, such as Osama bin Laden. One in particular in the book, With You Too, was the meeting the family of a suicide bomber where you tried to dissuade the younger brother from following in his older brother's footsteps. I can't imagine how hard that conversation would have been for you. But the question I have coming from that story is, how did Robert gain such access and trust with people that he could write about these stories and bring it forward in the public realm?
Well, I think the main thing was that covering the Middle East for Robert was not an adventure or a career move. A lot of people would get posted to various places as foreign correspondents or war correspondents, they like to call themselves. Robert never wanted to be called a war correspondent. They assume that this is either a career move. They go to a place and they see themselves as an outsider. They cover the stories for a few years and then move on to the next place. For Robert, it was not at all. And he, in fact, advised a lot of young reporters to say that if you like to take this on as a career for yourself and it's a life, you must make the commitment to not treat it as an adventure, because Middle East is not an adventure, it's a tragedy. And so he really felt the injustices that were being done in the region and by their own dictators and autocrats or monarchs, as well as by the Western governments who propped up these dictators to a large extent. And so he felt that sense of outrage that average people felt on the ground. And he had a lot of compassion for that. People felt that sincerity in him. Wherever we went together, immediately, didn't matter whether they were pro or con a regime or a group or a mentality, they gravitated to talk to Robert because they felt that he was sincerely there to want to understand what was happening to them and hear their stories. It wasn't just he was looking for a little quotation to fill in the gaps between whatever agendas that were going to come. The thing that really also worked very well for him, Robert is among the very few, if not the only foreign reporter who went back to the same story again and again and again. He went back to the same family if they have lost a member. He went back to the same hospital to check on the people that were injured or brought in there, or the doctors who treated those patients. But particularly when the story was no longer popular, for example, Armenian genocide, when Robert started writing about it, interviewing the survivors of the Armenian genocide that were in Lebanon or in Syria because they were expelled from Turkey, obviously, most of them were survivors because they had seen their family members, their parents, their uncles being executed in front of them. Most of them have got sick along the way as they had escaped the atrocities. And Robert would go collect their stories, write about it. At the time, it was the most unpopular story because Turkey was the only country that expelled Robert as a reporter. He was never expelled from any other country in the region, including Israel. But Turkey was the only country that expelled him because he wrote about Armenian genocide, because the Turks did not want any acknowledgement of the atrocities of killing 1.5 million Armenians during the First World War. And so he doggedly went after that story. Everywhere around the world where he could find a survivor, he would interview them, he would write about them. If there was a little museum of Armenian artifacts, he will go to it. If there was an exhibition of Armenian maps, we will be dragging ourselves into all corners of places to witness these. And a lot of reporters didn't really care about it. They might have covered one story and then they forgot about it, or they went along with the agenda of the whatever was the politics of the day. Sabra and Shatila is one of those other stories where Robert was the first one to be on the scene. This is between September 16 and 18, the Israeli forces watched while the phalangists massacred the Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila camp in 1982. But he went for the anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila. He went every year back to the camp. You know, a lot of people decided, well, we covered the story and moved on. But Robert kept going back. He talked to the survivors. And I think this was one of the reasons why he built that degree of trust. And people realized that he wasn't just there for the photo op or just for a headline. And he really did care about people's, individual stories and tragedies and experiences. So I think, yes, and that brought about a lot of jealousy among his colleagues because just couldn't do the same thing.
One of the most extraordinary characteristics of the book is Robert's ability to not only document the overarching geopolitical events of our times, but to tell real stories of people, which you've just spoken about, mostly average civilians who have suffered unbearable and unimaginable losses, the real cost of war. So many journalists would simply dismiss the tragic human cost that Robert painstakingly covers. This is actually very evident in a recent review by Robert Worth in the New York Times, where he writes, quote, "It isn't clear what Fisk thought his reporting would achieve. Much of what he has to say is now grindingly familiar to an audience that has grown numb after a quarter century of lurid Middle Eastern violence," end of quote. I have to tell you, Nella, this article and that quote from the reporter made me so mad. But I think it does raise an interesting question. What was Robert trying to achieve in writing in the way that he did?
Well, first of all, American media is particular. American mainstream media is particular. There was no love lost between them and Robert because Robert continuously, all the time, criticized the American mainstream media. He refused to go on CNN because he thought they were going to use him as a soundbite. They never really cared very much about the real stories at the time when they were trying to interview him. He also criticized the New York Times ferociously, reminding them that the New York Times of 1950s was braver to talk about the situation of the Middle East than the New York Times of our current times. And one of the things, the bone of contention with Robert among the mainstream media in the West, particularly in America, is over the question of Israel. They can appreciate and applaud him on the subjects of covering Afghanistan or many other conflicts, but not on the subject of Israel and Palestine because of the power of the pro-Israeli lobby and because there is the fear of losing your jobs and being vilified. So even if privately some of the reporters might have somewhat sympathized with the position that Robert had, they did not have the same courage to stand out and speak it, with exception of course, very few. And so I'm never surprised when I see anything snotty coming out of American media in relation to him. It happened during his life and they don't shy away from doing the same, after his death. What Robert was trying to achieve in writing the way he did, and he again outlines it very sort of clearly in the preface of the book, is that after watching atrocity after atrocity, we have come to live in a world where war crimes have been acceptable. And this was the biggest warning that he put it in the preface as one of the themes of his book, or The Night of Power, that because after September 11th, America went to Afghanistan and to Iraq, they broke all kinds of rules of law that was enshrined to protect civilians. And it was enshrined after the end of the Second World War because we wanted to live in a better world. And for a very long time, the West liked to set itself apart as a place of great value and moral value because we valued the lives of individuals, even in a place of war. Even if your enemy was captured, you do not shoot them, you bring him for trial. But what America ended up doing after September 11 made all those international laws outdated. And Robert argues that in favor of a new morality, the Americans have created a world that is setting a very dangerous precedent. Because if they're doing this and they're justifying it in the name of self-defense, then who are we to criticize Putin's Russia or criticize Assad's Syria or criticize even Netanyahu's Israel? Because the biggest power, which is America, has already done the same thing, breaking international rule of law. So that's what Robert was trying to achieve, is that whatever may sound like a very familiar, grindingly familiar one, it's because unfortunately the situation in the Middle East since the creation of State of Israel is not been anything better than it had been before. It has continued to deteriorate and be worse. So going back to these stories, if you really are not going to write for the headline and you're going to care about the real tragedy, those stories are very similar. You're going to go across the Middle East and you will find as many people tortured and tormented or had to escape, or they would have to collaborate, or in the case of Palestinians, have to be expelled from their homes and their land has been stolen from them. So the stories are grindingly familiar, of course, but I actually don't agree with the fact that people have become numb to it. I think it's the Americans, unfortunately, that have grown numb to it, or a segment of American society. And the danger in that is that right now we see the proof that the fact that someone like Trump gets to be elected with that degree of majority and support, and not to say that the Democratic Party in America did have any moral standing that they could hold up to. But when you see the most powerful country in the world so bankrupt morally, then of course I think you can understand that maybe they have grown numb because it's the failure of their own media. In my view, where we are in the world in relation to America, not because there are bad guys like Trump out there, but it's because the American mainstream media has failed to do their job properly. If they did not chime along the lines with the Israeli propaganda or the powers, and they actually took criticism that individuals, American reporters, but people like Robert, would withhold to them and say, look, your policy is wrong. You're supporting dictators, and then you go topple them down when they turn against you. That's not freedom. That's not democracy. And you brand these wars where you break international law as right for defense or democracy. This is wrong. So if the American reporters, mainstream media took that and they tried to amplify it, I think we would have been in a better place today when it comes to the American politics.
Mm-hmm. For over 400 days, we've witnessed the horror of the genocide in Gaza by Israel. In the book, Robert documents the erosion, in fact, you've just spoken about this, the erosion of post-World War II human rights standards and rules of war. And in that sense, maybe predicting the current situation in Gaza. But then again, he points to an exception for Gaza where he writes, quote, while the West Bank is being successfully consumed by another nation, Gaza's 146 square miles are being crushed by that same nation, but are undestroyable, end quote. What do you think Robert would think now with what's going on?
Well, he wouldn't be surprised at all because he has been, he was writing about the same kind of land theft that was happening each time, he in fact, in his notebook, the research for this book, which I have, and it's an enormous amount of information, did a specific calculations of the number of times that new settlements have been issued, how many more new homes to be built, and how much more land it was going to use. He wouldn't have been shocked or surprised. He obviously, as always, he would be absolutely appalled and angered by what's happening. But one of the things that we used to always discuss as we traveled around various places was he placed a lot of faith in the Jewish population. He used to say to me that the Palestinians have been brought down to a level because of especially the inner fighting between the PA and Hamas, and also because of the living in a society where you're demoralized, you're demonized, you have no access to anything for growth and development, and yet you only can survive through an act of violence, though majority of Palestinians would not want to choose violence as a way or as a method of survival. But Robert used to say that my hope is placed on the conscientious Jewish population, whether inside Israel or abroad, because they're in a position to try to say this is outrageous and this should have not happened. And we can see elements of that. In a way, the chapters on Israel and Palestine in the book, the 3 chapters, are very prophetic in a sense that he actually, the outline of the book, and in those chapters, he talks about, for example, he talks about this very brave Jewish American reporter, Dorothy Thompson, that was the voice of the Jewish population, because during the Second World War, when the Americans were refusing to accept the Jewish shiploads of distraught people were arriving in their shores, and the same in Canada, we were turning them around. But Dorothy Thompson was going and campaigning for campaign against Hitler and trying to save and support the Jews. When she went to Israel in 1948, she wrote very bravely that this state should be based not on the situation of a biblical idea, but it should be treated as an equal nation with every other nation. So then we would be withheld with the same rule of law as any other nation. For that small criticism, she was vilified in America. And they dropped her column in 1947 from the New York Post that she was writing a regular column, and she was called an anti-Semitic. So Robert brings out these examples of historical precedent of what we are witnessing right now, the kind of silencing that goes on, that everybody who speaks anything critical of the state of Israel or the IDF, they are considered an anti-Semitic. So this is why I think what he talked about Gaza was that the reason why he considered it that it's undestroyable is because Robert also believed that at the end of the day, there will be enough outrage in the world against the atrocities. And as we are witnessing now, the starvation of a population, in fact, in north of Gaza, the forced expulsion of the population, which is the kind of pogroms that happened in Russia to the Jews. So he saw a kind of a parallel that perhaps at a certain point in history, it will be the Jewish population around the world with that sense of morality and conscience to say no and stop this. And therefore, it will make the possibility of existence of a Palestinian in whatever form, a possibility, although he always talked about that he was so much more pessimistic at the end of his career, as you used to call it jokingly, than when he had started looking at the reality of what was happening, but mostly because of the culpability of the Western powers.
Nelofer, I know we could speak for much, much longer because you have so many amazing insights, not only about the book, but also your own experiences and travels with Robert and your own thoughts about what's going on. So I really want to thank you so much for taking the time today to share your insights and why this book is so important.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That was Libby Davies and Nelofer Pazira-Fisk in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Libby and Nelofer. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Here to bring us up to date is Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. This week in national news. Justin Trudeau announced his resignation as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party on Monday, January 6. During his press conference from his official residence at Rideau Hall, Trudeau explained that he would remain Prime Minister until his successor is chosen. He also stated that he asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament until March 24th, suspending all business in the House of Commons and Senate. After 9 years as Prime Minister, Trudeau and the Liberal Party are facing historically low approval ratings. Had Trudeau not asked Parliament to be prorogued, he likely would have faced and lost a motion of non-confidence in the House of Commons. When Parliament returns on March 24th and a new Liberal leader is selected, a federal election will likely be triggered shortly afterwards. In Labour news this week, leaders from Canada's major unions reacted to Trudeau's announcement. Unions such as Unifor and the Canada Building Trades Unions thanked Trudeau for passing key pieces of legislation aimed at helping the working class, like a federal anti-scab bill, pharmacare, childcare, and a national dental care plan. Other leaders, like the Canadian Union of Public Employees, said that it was time for new leadership. Both Unifor President Lana Payne and Canadian Labour Congress President Bia Brusk emphasized the importance of fighting for the working class as Canada faces an uncertain political future. In a statement earlier this week, Brusk said, quote, "This is a moment that demands an all-hands-on-deck, cross-partisan approach to stand against economic disruption and ensure stability for the working people who drive our economy. Workers should be central to this effort." End quote. Also this week, if the polls are accurate, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is likely to become the next Prime Minister of Canada. If he is elected, this would raise doubts about the future of key social programs that were passed by the Liberals with the help of the NDP, like the National Dental Care Plan. Already covering seniors and those with disabilities, the National Dental Care Plan was set to be expanded to people between the ages of 18 and 64 from low-income households early this year. With Parliament prorogued, however, there is concern that this expansion won't happen, and even if it does, there is a strong possibility that Poilievre would shut down the program entirely if he were elected. Dr. Brandon Doucette, a dentist based in Nova Scotia and founder of the Coalition for Dental Care, expressed his concerns in an interview with Rabble. Doucette said, quote, "If the program is not fully up and running, it's not going to continue to get expanded. It's supposed to cover 9 million people, so only about 1/3 of what it's supposed to be at the moment." End quote. Also in Canadian politics this month, join us on Wednesday, January 15th for Off the Hill, Election Year in Canada. We're not even halfway through January, and already the political landscape in Canada is in flux. From the not-so-surprising announcement of the resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States, there's no shortage of what to discuss in this month's Off the Hill political panel. Join MP Nikki Ashton, writer and activist Judy Haven, economists Jim Stanford and Stuart True, and Rabble's own parliamentary reporter Carl Nirenberg in conversation on Wednesday, January 15th, 2025 at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, hosted by Robin Brown. Register today to attend this free panel with a link you can find on rabble.ca. And as always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nirenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.